Hughes. I run a program here. This is a very interesting day that we're offering to you. We're going to be looking at the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But what is the role of Mexico, which already has a free trade agreement with Europe, and the role of Canada, which almost has such an agreement? And both of them, of course, are active partners in the Trans-Pacific trade negotiations that are going on. Today's program actually is a product, again, of a collaboration of a number of programs here. Mexico Institute has been in the lead under the direction for this program of Chris Wilson. And of course, the Canada Institute, I think David Biet is here, and also there he is right there, and the Global Europe program, and then of course my own program that focuses on globalization and innovation. Let me just say a word about the center for those of you that are new to us. We were established in 1968 as a living memorial to Woodrow Wilson. As you may know, Wilson was the only president to have earned a PhD, and in his era, he was a very prominent political scientist with several books to his credit. Went on, of course, to be president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, and a two-term president. When they established the living memorial, Congress wanted us to bring together both sides of Wilson's life, that side that was doing the best thinking and analyzing and writing about public policy, together with people that were making or influencing public policy. We do that with a host of top regional programs, Mexico Institute being a prime example, and at the same time we will bring a host of scholars. As many as perhaps 150 people will do some kind of policy-related research here at the center over the course of the year. Well, now it is my extraordinary pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Ambassador Carla Hills. I had not looked at her bio until just this occasion, since the last time I was able to introduce her, and it is just an awesome list of accomplishments. She started life by founding a major law firm in Los Angeles. She went on to be U.S. Trade Representative in the George H.W. Bush administration. Under the Ford administration, she was both at the Department of Justice and the Secretary of HUD. She sits on a host of publicly traded corporate boards and is a key member of a series of not-for-profit boards, all of which you would recognize. The National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, the Inter-American Dialogue. She's the co-chair of the Council on Foreign Relations, and it goes on, and even a member of the International Crisis Group. She, at one point, was an adjunct professor at UCLA Law School. She is clearly a Wilsonian kind of figure with that academic bent as well as a great deal of public policy service. She has, not surprisingly, a sterling academic degree with Stanford University, Yale Law, and studied at Oxford as well. She holds a host of honorary degrees, and also in the year 2000, I think, was awarded the Aztec Eagle, which is the highest honor given by the Mexican government to a non-Mexican citizen. It's very hard to know what title I should use. Is it Madam Secretary? Is it Ambassador? Personally, I prefer the appellation first developed by President George H.W. Bush when he named her U.S. Trade Representative and described Carla as the Velvet Crowbar, pointing to that mix of diplomacy and determination that was going to open markets all around the world. Maybe I just better say, Madam Everything, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that very, very exaggerated and wonderful introduction. It's a great honor to be here with you at the Wilson Center. You do so many interesting things here. We are to focus on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And President Obama said in his State of the Union February 12th that he said, we will launch a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. And I should correct the record. I meant transatlantic, not trans-Pacific there. And on June 17th, at the fringes of the G8 summit, he and the European leaders did indeed announce the launch, the formal launch. And just 2 weeks ago, the first meeting of the leaders took place. And prior to the launch, some of us suggested that the agreement ought to include Canada and Mexico, our first and second single largest trade partners. And this conference focuses on the benefits and the challenges of including our two NAFTA partners in this transatlantic trade and investment partnership known as TTIP. And I think before assessing the significance of including Canada and Mexico in the negotiations, it's useful to lay out what is at stake for the United States and the European Union in terms of the potential benefits and challenges. And without a question, TTIP is a very big deal. The United States and the European Union together account for more than half the world's GDP, 40% of global trade in goods and services, and 80% of the global capital markets. And our two-way trade in goods and services is $1 trillion, supporting 13 million jobs. And our two-way investment is nearly $4 trillion. Roughly half our foreign direct investment goes to Europe, and 62% of Europe's comes to us. And apart from tariffs on agriculture, textiles, apparel, and footwear, which are relatively high, our average tariffs are quite low, about 3%. So the biggest potential for boosting economic growth comes from eliminating or harmonizing the web of technical differences that we have in our safety standards and certifications that seek to protect our populations from the risk to their health, safety, environment, and financial security. And making these rules more compatible and less cumbersome would greatly reduce the costs and complexity of doing business both across, and I must say on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Currently, our entrepreneurs confront a maze of different regulatory standards and outright bans on a long list of goods, from automobiles to pharmaceuticals that add to their costs. Regulatory differences also burden services like aviation, maritime, and packaging, making suppliers less efficient. So big gains will come from harmonizing and coordinating safety standards to permit products that are tested and found safe in use on one side of the Atlantic to be considered safe on the other. For me, it's hard to believe that a product like an automobile in the United States and the European markets have different safety mandates covering lights, door locks, brakes, seats, seat belts, and electric windows, and constructing separate manufacturing facilities on either side of the Atlantic to respond to these sorts of differences is extremely costly. So such standards, if not harmonized, could at least be recognized as providing the equivalent in safety. Also instigating a closer coordination of the process of how we assess the safety of products would allow the regulatory agencies on both sides of the Atlantic to assess the product, say, take chemicals, and assess them in the same time frame and exchange test results and their assessment so that companies wouldn't have to face duplicative testing. And that would save costs both for the government and for the companies. And even greater gains would come from harmonizing our respective rules that set qualification standards for services such as engineering, finance, telecommunications. And we could also use the occasion to remove some of our obsolete regulatory processes. Ed Grescher, director of the Progressive Economy, points out, rather than requiring, as we do, paper filing with as many as 48 separate agencies to document the value of the goods, compliance with legal issues like sanctions, and a host of other regulations, why not construct a single regulatory window allowing exporters to file online once their cargo manifests and various compliance reports. And that would reduce costs both for government agencies, exporters, importers, and make our trade much more understandable. And reforms in these areas, just a few I've mentioned, and there's so many more, would make our supply chains more efficient and be an enormous boon to small and medium-sized enterprises that too often find the complexities just too hard. And so it's an insurmountable barrier for their participation in exports. The European Center for Political Economy estimates that a broad and deep agreement that eliminated the few but high remaining tariffs between the European Union and the United States and harmonizing our regulatory differences could increase U.S. exports to the European Union by 17%, Europe's exports to us by 19%, adding $157 billion to the EU economy, $126 billion to the U.S. economy, and $134 billion to the global economy. Also, achieving a good agreement would set a high standard and encourage the removal of unnecessary and redundant barriers globally, and might even bring the folks back to the table to finish Doha. But achieving that goal won't be easy. Our legal and regulatory differences are many, and political pressures on both sides resisting change are substantial. For example, Europe will push for the right to purchase U.S. air carriers. Our law puts a equity cap at 25%. There are interests in the United States that will oppose that change. Europe will also push for maritime access to permit their ships to pick up, say, in New York and deliver to the Baltimore harbor. And that is banned under the 1920 Jones Act. Again, there are groups in the United States that will resist. And we will want to find ways to reduce the unnecessary divergences regarding health regulations that adversely affect our ability to export food from meats to grains, and to bring Europeans' environmental standards and rules governing the protection of intellectual property closer to ours. But there are groups in Europe that will resist. And in assessing the benefits and challenges of adding Mexico and Canada to TTIP, we need to ask how their participation would affect our reaching a successful agreement. Now, in my own view, enlarging TTIP to become a North American EU transatlantic trade and investment partnership could very, very substantially add to the benefits of all the participants in a number of ways. First, it would strengthen the agreement by adding 150 million consumers and $3 trillion in GDP. Second, it would augment the valuable efficiencies that would be lost or diminished if the North American regional platform is ignored. Since NAFTA took effect 2 decades ago, an integrated supply chain has developed among the 3 North American economies that is truly unique. As a result, intra-regional trade flows are up by 400%. Today, Canada, Mexico, and the United States not only sell things to each other, they make things together. And for every dollar that Canada and Mexico export to the United States, there's 25 cents of American content in the Canadian goods and 40 cents in the Mexican goods. So having different rules, standards, and obligations for the 3 North American partners would substantially reduce the efficiencies that we have derived and could continue to expand upon in the NAFTA. Also, Canada and Mexico's participation in these negotiations would enable the North American governments to capitalize on and to add a force to the work being done by the U.S.-Mexican high-level regulatory Cooperation Council and the U.S.-Canada High-Level Regulatory Council, which seek to reduce unnecessary divergence between our regulations in North America. And the work plans of both of those councils identify many, if not most, of the same regulatory areas as needing attention as were identified by the U.S.-EU high-level working group preparing for the launch of the TTIP. And third, an agreement that included all three North American economies would reduce the complexity of doing business across the Atlantic. Since Mexico already has a trade agreement with the European Union, and Canada is in the final stages of negotiating one, the difficulty of dealing with three separate agreements in terms of rules of origin, custom measures, and border red tape would be a real headache and a necessary cost burden for entrepreneurs on both sides of the Atlantic. And the participation of our northern and our southern neighbors in TTIP could significantly streamline and simplify transatlantic trade and reduce those transaction costs and eliminate the avoidable distortions. Fourth, it would provide the participants with an opportunity to upgrade provisions in existing trade agreements negotiated some years ago, like the NAFTA that took effect in 1994, and the Mexican-European Free Trade Agreement that took effect in the year 2000. In each case, the intervening years have seen significant advances in a number of areas, particularly in the services, like telecommunications and digital data flows, and these gaps could be addressed. And fifth, adding Mexico could facilitate President Peña's program of economic reform and modernization that seeks, among other goals, to open telecommunications and the energy sector. Obtaining the substantial benefits that Mexico could derive from joining TTIP could provide the president with political support for his proposed reforms, that is, political support at home. And clearly, there are huge benefits in having Canada and Mexico join the transaction. I just named 5, but what about the challenges? And it's certainly possible that adding 2 neighbors to the negotiations would add some complexity to the negotiations. For adding more parties, there is the potential for more divergent views. For example, Canada and the European Union have been negotiating their bilateral agreements since 2009. The two sides seem to be held up, at least in part, by the fact that Canada wants greater access to the European market for beef and pork, and Europe wants greater access for brand name drugs and transit procurement, all politically sensitive issues for each. In my view, the benefits of having Canada and Mexico join the TTIP greatly outweigh these potential negotiating challenges. And to prevent any disruption to the negotiations that could result from a change of heart by either or both of our neighbors, we could proceed as we did in the NAFTA negotiations, agreeing at the outset that if either one or both were to drop out for whatever reason, the remaining parties would continue the negotiation. And if for whatever reason, political or economic, either or both, decide they don't want to join and finish the negotiation, drop out before it's finished, or not join at all. In my view, we should create a high-level consultation mechanism to ensure that we frame our regulatory changes in a fashion that does not make the North American region less competitive. And one way to do that might be to form what some have called an eminent persons group comprised of representatives from the 3 North American economies to provide advice on how the proposed regulation and their changes would affect the competitiveness of our tightly interlinked economies. But to ignore our northern and our southern neighbors in this ambitious and potentially highly valuable negotiation, in my view, would be a big mistake. And I look forward to hearing what my colleagues up here have to say about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hills, for the wonderful remarks. Of course, the one thing that Kent didn't mention is that you were also the lead negotiator for the United States during the negotiation of NAFTA, which very much has a lot to do with what we're discussing today. Thanks also to all of our other great panelists for joining us up here on the stage, for joining us here today. We're really looking forward to having a discussion. We sort of picked our panelists so that we now have up here people representing the perspectives to at least a certain degree of each of the regions or countries that we're considering in this discussion. So have someone representing the Mexican perspective, Canadian perspective, and the European perspective. And of course, Ambassador Hills helping us make sure we're still incorporating a U.S. perspective as we have a discussion as well. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and then pass the things on to them to each give us a presentation sort of from each of their perspectives on what some of the benefits, potential benefits of bringing in other countries to the negotiation, but some of the challenges are as well. We'll especially be looking at Canada and Mexico as is noted in the program, but I think Michelle might help us think about what this looks like from a European perspective, being that Europe also has periphery countries that are making noise, that are bringing up the discussion about whether or not they should perhaps be involved in an agreement like this as well. So starting here, we have Kenneth Smith, who's the head of the Trade and NAFTA Office of the Ministry of Economy at the Embassy of Mexico here in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us. Prior to serving in his current post, Mr. Smith was General Coordinator for International Affairs at the Mexican Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock, Rural Development, Fisheries, and Food, where he was responsible for agricultural trade negotiations. He's also previously worked at the Mexican Federal Competition Commission as Director General for International Affairs, at the Ministry of Economy previously, where he was Director General for Assessment and Monitoring of Negotiations. He has a bachelor's degree from Georgetown here in Washington, D.C., and a master's degree from, is it SAIS, I think, at Johns Hopkins University. So has been with us here in Washington for a while. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We also have Louis Belanger from Canada. We'll be presenting things from a Canadian perspective today. He's the director of the Institute for Advanced International Studies at Laval University. He's held various visiting professors and fellowship positions, not least of which was a fellowship here at the Wilson Center a few years back. We're very delighted to have him then and delighted to have you back here today. He's founding president of the Canadian chapter of International Studies Association, and he got his PhD actually from Laval University previously. Thanks a lot for being here. And last but certainly not least, Michelle Egan, who's a professor at the same university where I received my master's degree, American University at the School of International Service. There she focuses on Europe. She gives classes on the European Union, relations of Western European nations, international relations of Europe, multinationals and globalization, all of the topics that need to be incorporated into a discussion like we're having here today. She received her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, MA from the University of Pittsburgh, as well as Virginia Polytechnic State University, and her BA from the University of Warwick. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Michelle. We'll start and just kind of move in order down the panel. So we'll start with Ken. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you very much, Chris. I would like, first of all, to thank the Wilson Center for the opportunity to participate here today with such a distinguished panel, to be able to share the panel with Ambassador Hills, one of the founders of the NAFTA. I want to frame the remarks that I'll make today in the context of Mexico's role in expanding transatlantic economic relations and how this relates to the importance that trade has had for Mexico over the last decades, and the efforts that we're doing to expand our trade to other regions of the world. So we must frame the discussion in terms of the importance that the NAFTA represents for Mexico when we look at the opportunities that the TTIP and negotiations bring to the table. Mexico's a $1 trillion economy, $742 billion in trade. So trade represents 70% of our GDP. That is why it is obviously an economic priority for the Peña administration and for previous administrations, since Mexico started opening up trade liberalization in the first and the end of the 80s with our entry into GATT, and then of course with the North American Free Trade Agreement and the 12 other trade agreements that followed that we now have with 44 countries. So Ambassador Hill mentioned a little bit of the benefits that we have within the NAFTA in terms of trade and the potential with Europe, but I think that we must frame it in the context of looking at the fact that when we look at the relationship within the NAFTA, yes, indeed, trade has more than tripled since the NAFTA came into effect, from 338 billion to over $1 trillion in 2012. But one of the key elements here is the strengthening of the supply chains that we have seen in North America, the integration across different sectors, which, as Ambassador Hills mentioned, has led to the fact that a large percentage of exports that take place within the NAFTA have, for example, U.S. Value added. We build things together, we're growing together in that sense. So 37% of the Mexican exports to the world have U.S. value added, 40% when exported to the United States. So we have built a network of joint production within North America, which is extremely valuable. And we must not just look at the trade balance numbers, but the degree in which many different sectors, from automotive, electronics, medical devices, aerospace increasingly, and in many of the subsectors of the agricultural sector, such as cattle, agribusiness production, have integrated within North America. So it's very interesting to see that in terms of Mexico's presence within the NAFTA, there's a strong interest in strengthening our relationship with our neighbors of the North. We know the trade figures with the United States and Canada. One of the issues that doesn't get much attention, and this is unfortunate, precisely because we have such a large neighbor in the middle, in between us, is that the relationship with Canada and Mexico in trade terms is very vibrant and growing. Trade between Canada and Mexico has increased 8 times since the NAFTA, reaching $35 billion in 2012. And it's very varied, just as it is with the United States, across all industrial, manufacturing, and agricultural sectors. So we see a strength going in the 3 directions, in the 3 countries within North America. So with our North American partners, we're working actively on strengthening the NAFTA, on bringing the next generation of the NAFTA to light, basically looking for ways to upgrade it. The NAFTA was negotiated over 20 years ago, and many of the disciplines that are now being introduced in other trade negotiations address issues in the economy that did not exist 20 to 25 years ago. So within the NAFTA, we're working on strengthening regulatory cooperation, creating a 21st century border, to have a seamless border to facilitate trade between Mexico, the US, and also cooperation with Canada on trade facilitation issues, innovation and intellectual property rights issues, and promoting small and medium-sized enterprises. And this is key for Mexico, because you have to realize that 90 to 95% of all our business activity in Mexico is done by SMEs, and primarily micro and small enterprises, many of which have less than 10 employees in their companies. So it's key for us to introduce those companies into the globalization efforts, and the strengthening of supply chains can address that issue. So we have individual instruments with Canada, the Canada-Mexico partnership, and now with the United States, a high-level economic dialogue. Well, all of these issues of strengthening the NAFTA are being discussed. So we're also pursuing activities internationally, such as the TPP negotiations, which is the most important plurilateral negotiation going on right now, which has several elements which are very interesting for the development of North America. On the one hand, we must clearly state that the 3 NAFTA nations are, in the end, in the TPP because it offers opportunities to diversify export destinations. For Mexico, still 80% of our exports are concentrated on the United States. So we're looking through our network of trade agreements and now through the TPP to create the opportunities to diversify, but also to strengthen supply chains by being able to source from countries that are in a region which will provide most of the growth in the world over the next few decades. So that's why Asia Pacific is so attractive. It allows to strengthen the North American supply chains, and most important for the discussion that we're having, it also allows North America to bring in new disciplines, the upgraded disciplines that I was discussing, into the forefront, and that can be incorporated into the NAFTA. So this is the NAFTA Plus that had been discussed for many years, can be incorporated through what is being negotiated in TPP, and of course in a parallel track of discussions with our US and Canadian partners of how these disciplines will incorporate into the NAFTA. So we all agree that these are compelling arguments when we talk about the reasons for North America to be in the TPP. And these arguments make perfect sense as well when we look at the trade relationship with Europe and with TTIP. And that's one of the main messages that I want to leave here today. In terms of these arguments on strengthening supply chains, providing an upgrade of the NAFTA, increasing the size of the pie where we can trade, those arguments apply perfectly to the TTIP. And as Ambassador Hill said, we in Mexico have our own trade agreement in effect with the European Union since the year 2000. It's a trade agreement that over the past 12 years has led to a tripling in trade between Mexico and the European Union. It has increased from $21 billion in trade to $63 billion in the year 2012. And as well as with the NAFTA, we have been starting to work with the European Union on upgrading our agreement. Because it's an agreement that's 12 years old, and many of the same arguments in terms of the disciplines that need to be upgraded with the NAFTA apply to our agreement with the European Union. And as I will explain briefly, between Mexico and the European Union, we don't have the level of liberalization across the board as we have within the NAFTA. So there are more areas to explore there in terms of upgrading. And we're concentrating, we launched in the context of a Mexico-European Union Joint Committee the commitment to launch a bilateral reflection group, which will analyze the areas that need to be upgraded. And here we're looking at several areas. We're looking at agriculture, where we have $1.5 billion in exports to the European Union, which accounts to only 5% of our total exports, and there's an enormous potential there. A lot of the trade that takes place in products such as, for example, in the agricultural sector, are in products that are not liberalized within the agreement. So they're not benefiting from the potential that they would if we were to eliminate tariffs and increase quotas. So there's 800 plus products that are not free in the agricultural sector. We look at great opportunities, as we've done in other regions in the world, to enter actively on products such as beef, pork, honey, bananas, tuna, asparagus. There's a whole list there of products that are targets for Mexico, where there's a lot of demand in the European Union, and where we could have great benefits directly. Also, when we look at services, in the agreement, we only include provisions on financial services. And there's a strong interest in looking at a temporary entry of business people, opening up professional services in the European Union. And also, in terms of investment, we have 16 bilateral investment treaties with the European Union countries. But we would like to introduce the ability within our agreement with the European Union to consolidate disciplines included in these bilateral investment agreements. And of course, there's the new issues that I was discussing in terms of, for example, that we're discussing in the TPP. Issues as WTO plus disciplines on chapters relating to technical barriers to trade, handling issues there on mutual recognition, harmonization and equivalence, some of the issues that Ambassador Hills touched upon. On sanitary and phytosanitary measures, this is key. This is an area where we need to work to improve disciplines and clearly established standards that can be equivalent and can facilitate trade between Mexico and the European Union. And the issue that is key, and all of these issues that I'm touching upon, of course, are key within the TTIP negotiations. So everything that I'm mentioning here applies to issues that the US is already addressing or will address within TTIP. And one of the advantages here, now that when we start looking at now that we see that Mexico is looking for this upgrade of their own agreement, Canada is in the process of finishing their own agreement, it just makes perfect sense to look eventually at the possibility of the North America doing a North America-wide negotiation with Europe. It's $800 billion in trade between the NAFTA partners and the European Union right now. The NAFTA countries already export $330 billion to the European Union, and the European Union exports $469 billion to the NAFTA countries. And when we look at not just the trade issues, but the investment component within North America, and I'll give the example for Mexico, that's where we begin connecting the dots and seeing how attractive it can be to have a North America and Europe trade agreement. The European Union is the #1 source of foreign direct investment in the US and the #2 source of foreign direct investment in Mexico. And European Union companies have invested about $110 billion in Mexico since 1999, boosting joint production and supply opportunities in high value added economic sectors that supply the Mexican markets, but the US and Canadian markets as well, and vice versa. So we already have a very strong opportunity for strengthening supply chains if we eventually make this a NAFTA-wide negotiation. We ran a small exercise in my office where we took the top 25 products traded between, on the one hand, United States, European Union, Mexico, the European Union, Mexico and the US, And we see a strong correlation in key sectors where there's trade going on in the three directions in many of the same tariff lines. You look at automotive, electrical equipment, medical devices, aerospace, and many others, but these are the top ones, where there's already a lot of intra-industry trade taking place. And multinational companies that are placed have established presence in the 3 North American countries and in the key European markets. So in a way, looking at this for Mexico, given that 40% of the EU foreign direct investment in Mexico is invested in the manufacturing sector, there's a strong potential to increase that both through an upgrade of the agreement that we have with Europe and by having a NAFTA-wide negotiation that can benefit and strengthen supply chains. So when we look at, just to conclude, at the possibilities of strengthening this relationship with Europe, Mexico welcomes the announcement of the United States negotiating the TTIP. We think it's something that'll can benefit the North American region. We feel that by strengthening our own trade agreement through initiatives that are going on domestically, let's say between Canada, Mexico, and the US, and also in the context of other trade negotiations, we will build a stronger North America. And in the end, the region will be strengthened if we developed a North American concept, a sense of identity which may allow us to become more competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world and approach international trade negotiations as a bloc, under the mantra of we build together and we grow together. And that's an approach that I think that it has been evolving in some sectors more than others, and I think we need to have that permeate within North America. And this identity is emerging in our efforts to integrate into the economies of Asia Pacific through the TPP, and we must definitely look at Europe as the next frontier for developing that relationship. So I want to thank you for your time, and I'm open to questions that you may have. Thank you.
It's all you.
Thank you, Christopher. I would like first to express, of course, my thanks to the center and to the different programs involved in this event. I've been on sabbatical here a few years ago, as you said, Christopher. It has been a wonderful experience, and it's always a pleasure to be back at the center. I also very much welcome the organizers' invitation to think hard about the implication of the launching of the TTIP for the NAFTA partners at NAFTA itself. I think it's something that has been not been widely discussed, and I think that we will have a good discussion here. I will use my 12 to 15 minutes to provide two short answers to 3 questions asked by the organizers. The first question is, and I'm sorry, I have a bit of a cold due to too much hotels and airplanes these few weeks. So the first question is, what are the consequences of the TTIP talks for Canada and its ongoing negotiation with the EU of a comprehensive economic and trade agreement, or what we call the CETA? Second question is, would it be in Canada's interest to switch from a bilateral strategy to a trilateral or a regional strategy in its trade negotiation with the EU? And the third question, final question, is what would be the consequences of the conclusion of a TTIP on NAFTA? I think that before answering these questions, 2 caveats are in order. First, I don't have privileged information on the content of the CETA negotiations, and my analysis is based mainly on leaked documents and informal information. So I think that some of the information I will be sharing with you should be taken cautiously. And second, it's extremely difficult to discuss, as we have just heard, the situation of the transatlantic negotiations without making references to the trans-Pacific situations. And I've tried hard in my talk to not confuse the two, but we have already joined the two discussion, and I look forward to it in the exchange with the other panelists and the public. So the first question is, sorry, what are the consequences of the TTIP talks for Canada and its own ongoing negotiations with the EU of a CETA? Because obviously, before discussing the possibility of Canada joining the TTIP, it is essential to consider what Canada has been able so far to negotiate alone with the EU and how the TTIP has interfered in the talks between Canada and Europe. The launching of the TTIP arrives, as it has been said, as Canada tries desperately to close the CETA talks that were supposed to be concluded last year and are since said to be in their very, very final phase of negotiations. And the TTIP clearly has been a game changer for Canada. I say that TTIP has been a game changer because it has changed the strategic dynamic of the negotiation at the EU's advantage. Before the TTIP entered in the stage, Canada had the advantage of the negotiations simply because the EU was demanding more than Canada in the negotiations. And the advantage was particularly evident in the last phase of the negotiation. And it is so because I would say that, in my opinion, in the earlier phases of negotiation, Canada had already made important concessions or had abandoned important offensive objectives, notably on worker mobility and regulatory cooperation, which were primary Canadian objectives and for which the negotiations delivered little results. Canada also backed down on traditional requests for a general exclusion of cultural products in the negotiations. On the other hand, most of the remaining issues on the table are issues for which Europeans are demandeurs, like the protection of pharmaceutical patents, some areas of government procurement, or market access for financial services, and financial services or dairy products. So in the final phase of negotiations, a balanced deal could not be reached without the Europeans making more concessions than Canadians on those last issues. And this was the situations before the TTIP talks were launched. So it is clear to me that the Europeans rightly perceive the perspective of the TTIP as a strategic advantage that may permit them to overcome this situation. And this is why they have slowed the tempo of the negotiations over the last months, whereas Canada would like to see it accelerated. They can now use the TTIP as a credible alternative to a failed CETA negotiation, a fallback option that the Canadians themselves don't have, in order to extract further concessions to Canadians. Therefore, the first immediate consequence of the TTIP negotiations for Canada is that it immediately lowered its bargaining power vis-à-vis the EU in the CETA negotiation, which means the perspective of an unsatisfactory deal or eventually no deal at all, which would be a second failure, by the way, since this is exactly the same situation we experienced in 2006 when the EU decided to end the talks. So Mexico may welcome the TTIP negotiation between the EU and the US, but on the Canada side, you know, it has been very, very perceived, not officially, but unofficially, perceived very, very badly. So that leads us to the second question I want to address. Considering all that I've just said, wouldn't it be a better strategy for Canada to join the TTIP talks instead of pursuing its separate bilateral negotiations with the EU? Note that this is exactly what Canada has done when it decided to join the US-Mexico negotiations in the early 90s, a move that led to NAFTA. So the question is, why not the TAFTA, or Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement? I'll leave aside here the big question of knowing if the EU and the US would be willing to extend an invitation. I think they wouldn't, despite what has been said by Secretary Hills. I'll also leave aside the fact that the Harper government in Canada would have an enormous political price to pay if, after having invested so much capital in the CETA, it would have to abandon it. If we leave all these questions aside and we concentrate on what would be the hypothetical gain for NAFTA of a change in the bargaining structure that would be brought by going trilateral or quadrilateral if Mexico also joined in instead of bilateral, what can we say? It all depends, I think, on the format of the negotiation, something that Secretary Hills has mentioned. If, as it would be probably the case, each of the North American countries would enter into the negotiation with Europe on its own, then Canada would be placed in an unacceptable position of vulnerability, I think. First, Canada would be the target of two giant on sensible issues like Canada's supply management system for agricultural products, investments in financial services and telecommunications, and even cultural exemption. Second, such a negotiation format would mean a de facto renegotiation of NAFTA, which would probably ends up with the disappearance of what remains its most significant benefits for Canada, that is, its Chapter 19 dispute settlement mechanisms for trade remedies. If, on the other hand, the possible but I think improbable negotiation format where the three NAFTA countries would jointly negotiate with the EU was available, then Canada and Mexico would lower the risk to get directly exposed to a common EU-US front. Canada could then, I think, find some interest in joining in. One reason is that, as it has been said, on many of the regulatory practices that make the bulk of the new generation of free trade agreements like the TTIP and CETA, Canada and the US share a common model of domestic standard making much more market-oriented than the European one. Negotiating along with the US would also make sense because the CETA negotiations has shown that it is extremely difficult for Canada alone due to the integration of the North American market to accommodate many of the European demands dealing with regulations and intellectual property. For example, if Canada were to alone accept European demands for the application on its territory of strict traceability systems for meat products or protection for geographical identification for cheese, it would immediately create issues of market access for US producers who would not be submitted to the same packaging requirement on the domestic market. A block-to-block agreement would also solve complicated issues of rules of origins. For example, the CETA negotiators are confronted with the problem of determining the Canadian content of cars exported from Canada. Due to the North American integrated value chain, it is almost impossible to do so. A block-to-block negotiation format would thus be logical. It would also be technically possible. Already the NAFTA Free Trade Commission has the authority under Chapter 20 to directly negotiate the accession of any country of group of countries. Of course, the negotiation of a TAFTA can hardly be considered as a simple accession of the EU into NAFTA, but this provision shows that a negotiating role for the Commission is at least considered as a possibility in the NAFTA text. However, the provision has never been used, and the NAFTA countries have never, in 20 years, negotiating anything as a bloc, even if this possibility has been briefly considered at the outset of the FTA negotiation, but I think Mexico was the first to renounce to proceed this way. Thus, although a NAFTA EU trade agreement would be a logical way to proceed, and Canada would probably benefit from it, the format of negotiation remains a problem. For Canada to enter on its own in a negotiation with the two economic giants that are the EU and the US would be too risky. A block-to-block negotiation could be a solution, but this would require a re-legitimization of NAFTA and the NAFTA institution, something that the US government would certainly be hesitant to do, I think, considering how the NAFTA is perceived by the American public opinion. Since it's highly improbable that Canada and Mexico will join the TTIP, then, and this is my third and last question, what will remain of NAFTA if the TTIP is successfully concluded? My short answer is not much, which means that the NAFTA advantage, the preferential treatment from which each North American countries benefit from on each other market, will have been further reduced by the combination of the GATT WTO treatment and the TTIP treatment. We don't know, of course, exactly what will be the final, the final outcome of the TTIP talks, but we can presume it will resemble what has been negotiated in the context of the CETA between Canada and the EU. If such is the case, then Europeans will enjoy on the American market a treatment almost equivalent to the one enjoyed by Canadians and Mexicans under NAFTA. They will, for example, benefit from similar investor-to-state dispute settlement mechanism. They will benefit from temporary entry rights for investor and service suppliers, from a negative listing system for services market access. Europeans may even get a more preferential access in areas like public procurement and financial services. CETA is said, in fact, to go well beyond the Canada-US agreement on procurement. The only significant remaining advantage, again, provided by NAFTA could be the protection offered by Chapter 19 DSM on trade remedies, which seems to have no equivalent in the currently negotiated CETA. But of course, we're not there yet. By analyzing the impact of the CETA and the TTIP on the NAFTA, we then realize how far we are now from the situation we were 20 years ago when we negotiated NAFTA. North America was then clearly a trendsetter for the future of trade liberalization. NAFTA has been used as a model for countless bilateral and regional trade agreements around the world, and the North American competitive advantage was then significant. Since then, we have dragged our feet and failed in our attempt to upgrade NAFTA and tackle the new regulatory issues that now CETA and the TTIP try to address. And this is despite all the regulatory councils that Secretary Hills has mentioned, and despite all the efforts that have been presented to us by Kenneth. I wish I could see the challenge posed by the TTIP as an opportunity to regroup around a common, an opportunity for our three governments to regroup around a common North American regional interest. But I'm afraid that the TTIP may simply contribute further to the erosion of the North American free trade area. I'll leave you at that. Thank you.
Could we pass that down to Michelle?
Oh, sure. I only have 3 slides. In some ways, I'm the odd person out on the panel. I thank the Woodrow Wilson Center, and it's great to be on a panel where you actually take a lot of notes and you're learning yourself as you hear from different perspectives. I wanted to start off by just making full 5 points, and the first one I'm going to make is a European perspective. What are we getting out of TTIP, and why is it important? Why is there so much, I would call it, EU-phoria going on? And of course, we talk about the rise of China. Le Monde talks about this very, very distinctively, so it is in the European press. The protracted economic crisis in Europe has received a great deal of attention. We're not having the massive stimulus, and we're dealing with the domestic impact of austerity. And so European leaders have really pinned their hopes on this trade agreement with the United States. The level of attention in Europe is just enormous. And for Canadian and Mexican observers, they're interested in talking about inclusion, access, participation. This is what framed my thoughts. And part of the strategic impetus for Europe is obviously the size of the market. But I think we also need to be cognizant of the fact that businesses on both sides are highly engaged in terms of NAM, US Chamber of Commerce, Business Europe. The level of mobilization is extremely enormous. I haven't seen this thing since probably the 1992 program. And secondly, we've also been commissioning reports. Ambassador Hills pointed to a number of the statistics, but both businesses themselves as well as think tanks has been commissioning reports on the economic benefits. And they range from what would happen if we just removed tariffs all the way through to non-tariff barriers and better investment rules. And we've had everything from roughly 0.5% in the EU in terms of raising gross domestic product to 0.4% in the United States. But you can find many reports. The other issue is that in some sectors, the groups are working together on specific issues. They are jointly putting in the auto sector or the chemical sector joint provisions and joint ideas. Again, sometimes this is for the first time. And so there's considerable public advocacy and media attention for this comprehensive agreement. So I want to put that in context for you to think about and for Europe, it's cutting tariffs in industrial and agricultural goods. That's still important. But the bulk of the EU interest is in market access for services and investment, opening public procurement, better enforcement and protection of intellectual property rights, and the unrestricted access or supply of raw materials and energy, something that is very important to the three partners. And then, of course, finally, the regulatory barriers and the promotion of international standards. That's Europe's large agenda. But the EU partly also shares America's strategic objective. It's not just a bilateral agreement, a TTIP. We also have some sort of concerns against emerging powers in terms of market access, compliance with intellectual property rights, access to government procurement, and also subsidies to state-owned enterprises. So in some respects, if you think about that not just being a bilateral issue, but the importance of global governance and the importance of global rulemaking, that's also very important for both Mexico and Canada. And so I also, we sort of talk about TTIP now, but going back many, many years, I think as well, there's been a lot of confidence building measures. This has not just come out of nowhere. We've been working on this for probably 1990 onwards. And so the context in which this is happening is we have no major trade disputes or escalations now between the US and the EU, in terms of existing ones. And we've also made some progress on resolving a number of long-standing disputes. And one of the areas perhaps to think about is for Mexico and Canada is we've actually come to agreement on secure traders. They've agreed on their supply chain security agreement as equivalent. These are very, very important sort of foundation and building blocks to push the agreement forward. So the last thing in terms of the European perspective, and I think this is very important here, is, adding countries. There is a change in Europe. We're now negotiating with 28 European states, which wasn't the case many, many years ago. There's also a degree of regulatory heterogeneity. We now have Central and East European states and Balkan states in that equation. And so we also have a treaty change. The Lisbon Treaty is very important for trade. And in that case, it brings all services and trade-related aspects of intellectual property into the EU competence. And more recently, the EU has decided all new bilateral investment treaties will also be part of the EU-level competence. And so what I'm saying here is trade diplomacy has also changed in Europe. Not only more regulatory heterogeneity, a new competence, and more importantly, as the United States has found out with ACTA and other issues, a new, quite visible European Parliament, which is playing a more significant role. And lastly, I would like to point out that the EU is also loaded with a lot of other initiatives. Most of us are thinking here about the Eurozone and crisis management, financial reforms, but it also has a whole host of other issues that I'd like to raise because I think they're important for this context. So I think we need to look at, my big point would be, we need to look at the bilateral, multilateral, and third country impact. And so my second point would be, if I can, the second point would be we're in an era of mega regional trade agreements, mega free trade agreements. If you look at what's happening here, TTIP is one of many evolving discussions. What's interesting is these are all preferential negotiations among industrialized nations. The second issue is they're increasingly comprehensive and focusing on a lot of non-tariff measures and regulatory barriers. And in both the US and EU agenda, there's a strong dose of cross-regionalism here. Beyond TPP and TTIP, the EU is negotiating recently or has completed with Japan, Korea, Singapore, CETA. So it's an ongoing. And so the EU's negotiations, if you think about it, are characterized primarily by bilateralism with individual states. So the other thing to also think about is that the EU has not used a standard model for its preferential trade agreements. We think about it as a one-size-fits-all, but the EU has a web of preferential trade agreements characterized by very different trade liberalization agendas and trading rules. Some of them have a development focus with the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. Some of them are association agreements with prospective new member states. Some of them are to promote stability on borders with Georgia and others. And then finally, there are those that we're most interested in with advanced states in terms of liberalization of non-tariff measures, non-discrimination, market access, and regulatory issues. But there's a range out there that the EU has. What's also interesting is all of these agreements between the EU as a bloc includes all member states and the other negotiating party. Individual EU member states are not party to agreements separately, and they can't make it separate from the union. There is a reason we use the word union. And so if you did that, it would be considered discriminatory and anti-competitive. There are no such prohibitions for individual bilateral agreements in Canada, in NAFTA or ASEAN. So, we negotiate as a bloc, and we have to. And so some might say, well, this all looks like, what we're doing in other areas of the world, competitive liberalism, to use Robert Zoellick's phrase, between the US and the EU and other free trade agreements, whether it's Korea, whether it's Japan, and so forth. But I think in terms of TTIP, it should be an important impetus for North American coordination, and it should build on the success of economic ties. But not only are Canada and Mexico the United States' most important markets and the largest source of energy imports, but it's also vital links in that North American supply chain. And I think that's been very much downplayed in the TTIP discussions. And that's really not been part of the European debate. So if you're going to make the case, you really do need to talk about the integrated North American economy. My third point would go to challenges and opportunities, third country impacts. And here I'm going to say Mexico, Canada, and Turkey, because I am coming from a European perspective. What would be the effect of TTIP on neighboring countries? That's what you asked us earlier. Well, some in Canada, and I'm glad Ambassador Hills has raised this, have advocated rolling the negotiations with the EU into a broader North American EU agreement. With the world's 11th, 14th, and 17th largest economies, respectively, Canada, Mexico, and Turkey have averaged annual growth between 2.5% in Canada, 4.4% in Mexico, and 6.3% in Turkey. And the Bertelsmann Foundation commissioned a study on this, and they argued, whether you agree with their statistics or not, that the three have the most to lose from a comprehensive TTIP agreement, with potential long-term losses of 9.5% for Canada, 7.2% for Mexico, and 2.5% for Turkey. And so the question then becomes what is the relationship with the EU and these states? Well, Mexico has a pared down, I had it down as a pared down FTA with the EU, which came into force in 2000. And it's already been raised as being upgraded. Canada remains in very difficult negotiations with the EU, and I think the TTIP is a game changer. And then Turkey, my country that I want to add to the equation here, has been in a customs union with the EU since 1995. And I want to suggest some parallels or considerations here in thinking about the outsider, the ins and the outs. And I want to suggest them because for Mexico and the United States, the Mexican ambassador talked on Wednesday about customs facilitation and borders and transaction costs. In Europe, the restrictions on transportation, the restrictive quotas for road haulage, Turkey objects to these very strongly and saying that they're extremely costly and one-sided. Cabotage restrictions, where you can't have trucks depositing and acquiring cargo at different points on long journeys. The same concerns and complaints that Turkey is raising to the EU, I heard again on Wednesday here in Washington. But Turkey has a different issue, perhaps even a more difficult one with TTIP, because Turkey in a customs union with the EU, it is not incorporated in ongoing FTA negotiations that the EU has with India, which has it's a major competitor, similar exports. It's also not involved in negotiations between the FTA with South Korea and now TTIP. It really is. And it's important to note that under the EU-Turkey customs union, Turkey has to align its commercial policy with the EU's common commercial policy. So it's bound to negotiate free trade agreements with the same third country as the EU does. But this doesn't mean that the EU includes Turkey in the negotiations, just as a warning here. And so as these third countries are aware of this obligation towards the EU, so it puts Turkey in a potentially difficult position because it has no influence on the EU common commercial policy. Effectively, it renders Turkey an EU satellite when it comes to commercial policy. So my point is also, finally, TPP's newest member, Japan. Japan is also negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU. And Japan must make certain microeconomic reforms to boost its long-term economic growth. But the goals and expectations of Japan and the EU are slightly different. Japan would like tariff elimination, focusing on high tariffs in a number of areas. The EU is really interested in non-tariff measures, government procurement, technical barriers to trade, certification standards. And the EU has already said we need to make progress in 1 year, otherwise we're going to rethink this. And so there is a time-sensitive issue here. So my point is there are multiple trade dynamics going on here, and there's an impact on third countries, not just Mexico and Canada, and that's the EU perspective. So in terms of challenges and opportunities, I'm just going to say a few, and then I'm going to put up some models and options. Being the academic and being not the trade negotiator, I'm going to do that. I think you're right. I think the first thing is we need to think about the length of negotiations. We're now 4 years into CETA. And it should give us some indication of how difficult negotiations are going to be between the US and the EU on regulatory and other issues. And when you think about past agreements with Canada, it's often been sectoral or general framework agreements. They're now much more complex and comprehensive negotiations being planned. The devil is in the details. The second issue, I would say, unlike the EU, NAFTA is a free trade area with each member country adopting individual import tariffs, and we have full competence in international trade negotiations. So perhaps as an outsider, this warrants discussion of a North American customs union, and perhaps also to think about fostering that bilateral dialogues that you have into some form of coordinated regulatory dialogue. How many people do you want us to negotiate with? The third issue and fourth would be access to agricultural markets. It's a contested issue in terms of Canada. Beef or exports, pork. It does make the negotiations, gives you some idea about what's ahead for the United States and the EU. But I would also argue the plurilateral government procurement agreement will be a huge issue. A lot of what the EU wants is at the state level. If you think about professional services, if you think about government procurement, a lot of it is about subnational and local authorities, and that raises a great deal of issues here, both in the United States and in Canada. And so, so from that perspective, I look at some parallels in the negotiations, government procurement access, especially in the United States with your stimulus package. It's very attractive to Europeans. If you look at it from, and then the area where perhaps we are more in agreement is on the area on biopharmaceuticals medicine. It's a key issue for the EU and the United States. Canada has expressed concerns over the impact of generic drugs and the costs. So there is perhaps some synergy between the EU and US in that area vis-a-vis Canada. And so a key issue will be rules of origin. Given the integrated supply chains and manufacturing with Mexico, what constitutes US products that qualify for custom-free imports into the EU? All of these are major challenges. And I would say when we look at transaction costs, when we look at the 3 separate markets, when we think about upgrading NAFTA, what are the 3 scenarios that you would like? The first one, do you want continued US and EU divergence, particularly in the regulatory sphere, in terms of data privacy, product and process regulations? We're starting to see differences over ACTA and so forth between the US and EU. And finally, over TISA, perhaps that might be an area. Do you want those kind of or would you prefer regulatory adjustments and enhanced regulatory cooperation that might serve as a model that you can then bandwagon on? Particularly thinking of the recent agreements on container security or the swaps recent agreement that was recently announced. Or do you want the third issue in terms of adjustment costs, which What happens if the EU's rules become very, very significant? What happens in terms of your adjustment costs? If you think about it, what if you have to adopt? And here I think of the EU's REACH chemical regulation, which has now been picked up by Australia, Canada, China, Japan, Russia, South Korea, as well as California and Massachusetts. It's an adjustment that you're making to EU rules and standards. Or if you think about the hazardous substance agreement, here with the disposal of common products, you know, China, Japan, South Korea, as well as Canada has also adopted versions of an EU rulemaking process. So which of those scenarios would, you know, is most beneficial in terms of your participation? So models and options. I'm not the trade negotiator. Here would be my suggestions. I'm the academic. What about a TTIP +3 model, sort of like the ASEAN +3 model that came out in 1997 in terms of the financial crisis, sort of a little bit appropriate. What about a TPP model that's going on now? Free trade agreements, you have open access. You have access and accession to an agreement at various points. You don't have to be there at the get-go. But then you have to accept already negotiated text and chapters. Do you want to be in that position to when something has, the boat has already sailed? The third model would be a European economic area. And here I think this is a model of deep and close market integration. It's those states outside of the EU. They have their own legal system. They have deep economic integration, but with common institutions for surveillance and adjudication of infringements when they arrive. These are the countries of Switzerland, Liechtenstein, outside of the EU. That's the third model. Perhaps the fourth model might be a North American customs union. And then the fifth model might be perhaps the EU and US should integrate and modernize their preferential trade agreements with third countries. And perhaps lastly, maybe they would think more in the regulatory issue and come up with a toolkit of options from a practical market point of access. Better evaluations for regulatory cooperation, substituted compliance, mutual recognition, common data requirements, collaborating on risk assessment or compliance methods, alignment of options, harmonization of methods, and quite frankly, what I would like to see, upstream regulatory cooperation, especially in new technologies. We tend to always talk about regulations that are currently in place that are divergent. What about the ones coming down the road? So can transnational trade agreements become engines to achieve a deep economic integration? The last model is differentiated integration. We've got an old vision of the EU. And our old vision of the EU is that it's harmonized and it's common. But if you think of monetary union, there are ins and outs. If you think of border controls, there are ins and outs. There are, so we could perhaps have an issue where there are areas of mutual interest where you are ins and out and have a more differentiated integration model. The EU does all of those things. So I'd like to conclude by making 2 points. Obviously, to get this through, you need to shore up support for trade in both Congress and in the public at large. And I think it's going to be easier than in NAFTA. And you will obviously have the issue of Trade Promotion Authority. You're going to have cross-cutting mobilization and opposition in the United States. Don't forget, we're going to have similar dynamics in the EU. And secondly, I would go back and say the legal mandate of the EU is a stumbling block here. It took 28 states a lot to get a negotiating mandate to negotiate this TTIP with the EU. You would have to go back and get another legal mandate to negotiate with NAFTA. That's very difficult. And secondly, Europe has really not covered CETA or its relations with Mexico in the same way it has covered TTIP. It's often forgotten that the EU has a large agenda outside of the Eurozone. I want to say to you, NAFTA, as you've rightly pointed out, celebrated its 20th anniversary recently, and in terms of economic depth of integration has been very successful. But it's also the 20th anniversary of the Single Market Program. And I heard, perhaps rightly or wrongly here, that NAFTA needs upgrading, NAFTA 2.0, and things have moved on in terms of services and trade since then. The one thing that we're not aware of and we don't pay attention to, the single market has been moving for the last 20 years. There are a whole host of new objectives and initiatives which we will now have to consider the transatlantic dimension of: the digital economy, the new professional card for professional qualifications, medical products, market surveillance, product safety. Just look at how many legislative acts we've been doing over the last 2-3 years. We're having difficulty completing our own single market. We've now got to look at the transatlantic impact of that. And so please don't forget that there's a lot going on, that single market has not been static, that you're going to have to keep following that as well as it moves forward with a whole host of new regulatory initiatives. So at some point, NAFTA and TTIP, my conclusion will be it needs to be coordinated. And we further need to explore, I think, the economic importance of TTIP, and I think we need to look at the immediate transitory trade diversion at the expense of third countries. But the devil's in the details. Anybody who's been around transatlantic trade negotiations, whether it's the new transatlantic agenda, tech, and everything else, knows that the issues that have been separating us are wide and long-standing, and that sometimes they do get bogged down. But I think there's a lot more political capital invested this time around. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you to all of our panelists. These were excellent presentations, and I think we're really going to get a good discussion going. We now have some time to take some questions, so please be thinking of your questions. We also are webcasting, and we can receive questions via Twitter and have them passed up here, so if anyone out there in the Twitterverse wants to talk to us, feel free. But as you prepare your questions and get ready, I want to just throw one out there on the table. I actually had some questions planned, but I think I would actually like to just refer back to something Michelle was just presenting in her sort of options and models. I think at one level, certainly what you're saying is North America should get its own house in order to be able to better deal with outside countries. And then I hear us saying, from the North American perspective, let's take advantage of this opportunity working with the EU or with the TPP to get our own house in order. So I wanted to just throw that out there, and there's a bit of a tension there. Which comes first, North American integration and then dealing with the external world, or taking advantage of negotiations with other countries in order to get our own house in order? So I want to throw that out there, and please feel free also to respond to some of the things that you heard among each other. We'll do a quick discussion here and then take questions from the audience. Would anyone like to start?
We certainly should get our house in order, Chris. There are so many things that we can do. I would not recommend to the administration that they reopen the NAFTA in order to bring it up to date. I think politically today that would not be a positive course. We certainly, as Michelle said, should do a great deal to educate the public about the advantages of open markets for trade, investment, people, ideas. We should do a lot more with their elected representatives. And I think that you need the cover when you want to have reform of the benefits that come from a new agreement. We saw that in the NAFTA. Salinas used the NAFTA as political cover for undertaking the reforms that he actually put in place by saying, look what we can get with the world's largest economy. If we open their market, we will boom. And he was correct. Yeah. But it was that carrot. And for us just to go back and say we want to do some technical things that fix our own economy, whether it be the elimination of filing 48 paper forms in New York Harbor versus having an an electronic filing once that all 48 agencies can look at. The fact of the matter is, it's going to be much easier if we can find a carrot. And I think that with the Doha slumbering and Europe needing an economic push, this is a very large potential carrot. And I recommend that we not turn our backs on it.
I think that, it's, of course, we should have our house in order. I think the problem is that for the last 20 years, we've tried to update NAFTA without a lot of success. And on the bulk of what is negotiated at the TTIP or the CETA level, which is basically regulations, we have had many experiences in North America. We've tried the SPP. Now we are in the process of trying two separate bilateral dynamic with regulatory councils that have not, I must say, given much results to date. So even if we don't reopen NAFTA, if we try to find other ways to be more efficient for coordinating our regulatory practices, it will need some political capital. And I think that you can reopen NAFTA to include this in the treaty, or you can find another language, another name for it. But both things have been tried, and up to now we've not found the political capital in North America for doing so. So I think that this is mainly the situation that we are facing now with Europe is problematic, and it's due to our own lack of action on these different topics. So now, as I said, I think that what I'm afraid will happen is that not only we will not be able to put our act together in order to face the European Union, but that our separate negotiation with Europe will contribute to the disintegration of the North American free trade area. So a less significant NAFTA will probably be the results of all this. But maybe I'm wrong. And maybe, the urgency or, the attraction for the kind of benefits that have been discussed here today will provoke something. But again, I think that we've been facing this for 20 years. We've not found the political capital or the willingness, the appetite to go this way. And also there's, as Michel said, there's the public opinion side of it. I think that I can't imagine that it would be profitable for the current U.S. administration to present to the public the negotiation with Europe as a NAFTA EU negotiation. I think it would be politically unwise to do so. Unfortunately, it's the case. So in the different scenarios that you're mentioning, including the possibility of the North American custom unions, no, we're not there yet.
Thank you. I think that when we talk about the upgrading of the NAFTA, we have to realize that this is a bit of sort of like a three-ring circus. There's many elements going on at the same time at different levels. From the Mexican perspective, for example, there's a true recognition that we can take advantage of our network of free trade agreements and what we have done in the NAFTA to the degree that we're able to introduce domestic reforms that facilitate our businesses to be able to take advantage of the existing opportunities. So domestic reforms must go hand in hand with this process of trade liberalization. So taking that into consideration, we see that within the NAFTA discussion, within the sort of the three countries that are looking at how to upgrade NAFTA, I agree with what Ambassador Hill said. It would be politically very dangerous to begin a process of reopening the NAFTA and trying to take issues back in terms of negotiating internally with different groups, with the legislatures, etc. In terms of the acceptance of the NAFTA, we're not where we were 20 years ago. Definitely, there's more of a recognition in all three countries of the great benefits that NAFTA have brought. But we have to look also at the multilateral context in the sense of taking advantage of what is going on in TPP, what will happen in TTIP, and I think that you can begin to bring the different pieces of the puzzle together and in a way benefit from the parallel process that are taking place. Within the NAFTA, of course, I would agree that there are many instances in which over the years we've not been able to advance as much as we would like to. There's many issues on the Mexican side that we would like to see perhaps a better functioning of the agreement, whether it's on dispute settlement, whether it's on temporary entry, whether it is in different areas in which we believe that an upgrade is necessary. But at the same time, I think that we can, from the Mexican perspective, continue to look at the opportunity to diversify, to look for advantages in entering other regions and seeing to what degree those disciplines can be incorporated into the NAFTA. Only in the TPP negotiations, for example, are we have a scenario in which we're negotiating with 11 other countries, and at the same time we're having parallel discussions with the US and Canada to identify what pieces of the TPP fit into the NAFTA in a way that incorporated to what is aimed at becoming a 21st century most ambitious agreement. So in terms of the TTIP negotiations, I wouldn't say that necessarily we look at it as a possibility that our preferences will be eroded. This is something that can happen. I believe that it is the case when we look at the type of trade relationship we have with the United States and the prospects of them negotiating with Europe. Obviously, there's a certain concern with a trade erosion. And that is why I think we can take take advantage if we enter into the negotiations. We think that it can be done in a stronger fashion if we do it as a bloc than if we do it individually. I believe it was mentioned that when the European Union negotiates as a bloc versus individual countries, there's a certain degree of advantage that Brussels has in those negotiations, because many issues sometimes at the level of Brussels can be argued in terms of saying, well, I would like to help you on this issue, but I have a few members that won't budge on this or that, and it's sort of a divide and conquer approach to the negotiation. If we're looking at this from the perspective of North America, working as a bloc, there's many principles that we established under the NAFTA where Canada, Mexico, and the US have similar positions. There's, of course, key elements where there's divergences, but we can gain strength by working together and negotiating as a bloc with Europe.
Thanks a lot. Michelle, do you want to add something now, or should we go to take questions?
Just two comments. Okay. I think there's a very nice parallel between the NAFTA and Mexico, because I think that structural reform is necessary in the EU, and in some ways what we're trying to do with deepening our single market, TTIP may help us do that, particularly open our service sector. My second point would be to look at, and sometimes I think we've forgotten the functioning of the European single market. We often sort of say, well, it's bilateral regulatory issues. We've got customs facilitation issues within NAFTA, within North America, and it's still a work in progress. I think we've forgotten that perhaps the single market in Europe is their work in progress, but they do have very effective dispute mechanisms and dispute settlement and a whole host of issues available in a toolkit, but it is a work in progress. And so I think we need to be careful that we don't sort of reify the completion of the single market.
Thanks a lot. All right, we'll open up the floor for a few questions from the audience. As you do so, please be brief, please identify yourself, and please wait for a microphone so we can make sure that everything's being sent out to the web as well. Looks like we have a first question right there, and then we'll take these questions here in the middle. We'll take 3 questions. We'll take these 3 questions and then go back to the panel, and then we'll do another round.
Hi, Vassan Kabayan from the Canadian Embassy. I just have first a comment and then maybe a question. My first comment, more to Monsieur Bélanger, is that yes, CETA, there is real pressure right now to complete this negotiation, but the pressure is not just on Canada. I think the EU is also feeling the pressure For Canada's perspective, some of the concern really is resource management on the EU side. Now that they are negotiating with the US on TTIP, how much attention will they really want to bring to Canada? But at the same time, there is pressure on the EU to complete this, because many of the issues that you've identified, the panel has identified between the US and the EU on areas that the EU is very much interested in, like government procurement, geographical indications, rules of origin. They want to demonstrate to the US that they can do something, and with an NAFTA partner especially. So there is pressure on the EU to complete that agreement as well, so that they can demonstrate that this is how far we can go. That conversely works also in the favor of the US in terms of TPP negotiations. They want to demonstrate to the EU what they can do. So there's always pressure on the big countries to complete these agreements so they can demonstrate where they can go with these agreements, because they speak a lot here locally, but to complete these agreements and to go far is also an enormous lift on their part. So my question really is now, seeing how TPP, TTIP, and maybe CETA are going to be WTO plus at some point, how do you perceive these agreements to eventually work in the overall WTO system? Because if you do these WTO plus agreements, there are many countries out there who are now significant countries like India and China and Brazil who are left out of these. Are they ever going to accept these extra disciplines within the WTO system? And then equally, when you're WTO plus, how do you deal with legal disputes? Because the WTO's big crowning achievement is the dispute settlement system that they have, that all countries have to follow. With these new agreements that go beyond the WTO, you won't be able to take them to the WTO to have a legal dispute fulfilled there. So how do you see that fragmentation working as well in the overall system?
Thank you. We're just going to take these two questions. If you could just pass the microphone over to this gentleman here in the... Oh, you got a question. And you, sir? Did you still have a question? Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Ed Gerwin. I'm an international trade consultant, and I was formerly senior fellow for trade at Third Way. I have a question about the panelists' best guess as to what will actually happen. We've talked a lot about the benefits of adding Canada and Mexico, and I have a particular interest as well in Turkey to the TTIP discussions. But what do you think practically will be the process by which those countries eventually join in this larger amalgamation? I know it's a lot of speculation, but I'm very interested in what your gut reaction would be as to how this, TTIP +3 model, for example, might come about.
Thank you. We can take one more question. Sure.
Thank you. My name is Graciela Riches. I am an independent consultant. And I want to ask you, in this type of negotiations, like the North Atlantic European Union Free Trade Agreement, the focus is generally given on the movement of trade and services. But how important would cross-border labor mobility be to cover the free movement of professionals and employees between projects and across borders? I think that the NAFTA had some provisions, if I'm not wrong, on this mobility of professionals. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go back to the panel. Jerry, would you like to start? Ambassador Hills?
Well, as to the first question, a concern that these ambitious mega trade agreements fracture the WTO, I would point to history to argue the opposite. In 1990, the Uruguay round broke down in Brussels. In 1991, the United States, Mexico, and Canada sat down to negotiate the NAFTA. 14 months later, it was completed, and in December of '92, President Bush Sr. signed the agreement. When President Clinton came in, he first said, "I don't really like the agreement." That was a political statement, "but I'm going to fix it." And after about 7 months of working with the government, side letters and so forth, it was presented to the Congress and passed. Within 4 months, all members were back at the table for the Uruguay round. The Bogart goals were announced at APEC. We were going to have a free trade agreement for advanced nations by 2010, no barriers, and for developing countries by 2020. And here in the Western Hemisphere, we were going to be no trade barriers among 33 nations. Now, we didn't get the last two, but we did get the Uruguay round done, and we did create the World Trade Organization. And that illustrates competitive liberalization. No one wants to be left out. And I can tell you, in my view, and sometimes I'm wrong, that if we were to have a successful agreement with Europe, or a successful agreement with our Pacific partners, or something ambitious with the Pacific Alliance involving the United States running down the Pacific coast with Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, that would have an effect on the global market. I think people are concerned that we're not moving forward. Now, there are lots of ways to have dispute settlement. TTIP could be adopting the WTO dispute settlement. That could be an agreement. So could the TPP, Trans-Pacific. They could adopt the WTO settlement. But NAFTA had its own settlement that was separate from the WTO. I think it needs to be strengthened. But I think competitive liberalization definitely works. So don't worry about that aspect. We just need political support.
Yeah, very quickly, I would just say that I believe that the trade agreements that are being negotiated worldwide could serve as a blueprint to strengthen the discussions in the WTO. Of course, there's no guarantee as how these individual negotiations will turn out and how they can influence, but just concentrating on two particular examples, I think the TPP, because of the diversity of the countries involved, different levels of development, and the nature of the issues that are being addressed there, it serves in a way a little bit as a research laboratory, if you will, as to how some of these issues could be resolved or addressed in the multilateral arena. I mean, that it's when you have countries as varied as the North American countries, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, that have different approaches to many of these issues, but when we're tackling issues such as SPS, TBT, rules of origin, etc., I think that's an interesting model where we can, in a way, transport some of those lessons to the multilateral arena. And I think that what you're seeing, for example, in another negotiation with the Pacific Alliance, you're seeing a strengthening of the efforts to integrate within Latin America on the trade front, but also across the board. This is an agreement that looks at cooperation elements, integration of promotion, trade and investment promotion agencies, support systems for SMEs, areas that have not been explored before or in this type of depth within Latin America. And of course, countries that are not part of it, such as Brazil, in the Americas, are taking notice of this. And hopefully that'll push to take both domestic policies and international policies that are aligned with these new trends that are happening worldwide. So I see those two elements on the TPP side and Pacific Alliance that can boost the chances for the multilateral discussions to start moving forward. On the TTIP, I believe it's too early. We'll have to see what begins to evolve from these complex negotiations. But one thing that is key and that was emphasized at the beginning of the discussion was that it's not so much on the tariff reduction side that you would get the benefits from a TTIP. It's precisely from these disciplines, from the non-tariff barriers that exist and the differences in standards and approaches, even philosophical in some issues. You know, when you look at SPS issues, et cetera, and the approach to food safety and other issues that need to be addressed. So I think that's going to be the key sort of contribution of the TTIP to this multilateral discussion.
Thanks. Would anybody like to jump in on the idea of guessing what will happen or the question of labor mobility?
Yeah. On these two things. On what will happen, I think that my guess is that there won't be a block-to-block negotiation. I think there will be a CETA negotiated probably at the end of the summer between Canada and the EU, and the US and the EU would go their own way. And I think that it will have the effects that I've mentioned on NAFTA and on the North American market. I don't see any, I'm not very optimistic about the possibility of the NAFTA partners taking this opportunity up to advance on the regulatory coordination front. I think that the bilateral agreements will be a little bit of a disappointment. I think that if we take the CETA example, I think that what we have on the table now is not exactly what we foreseen at first. The negotiation is, as it has been said, on regulatory coordination and regulatory practices. And basically there are two types of issues. There are a whole bunch of issues that the European wants to address under the form of minimal treatment in intellectual property, in other issues like geographical indication or SPS. And this is very difficult. I think that Europeans will have achieved less than they will have hoped for. On other regulatory issues, basically what is done is that you put together a mechanism for ongoing, regulatory harmonizations. So far, on the CETA, the mechanism, is much more a voluntary kind of, mechanism, something that we already have, both at the EU-US and Canada-EU levels. So I think that there will be a little bit of disappointment on the, I would say, level of comprehensiveness of what will be achieved both at the CETA level and at the TTIP level. On labor mobility, yes, this is something that is interesting in the CETA negotiation. A lot of sensitive, one of the most sensitive issues in the CETA negotiation has been labor mobility. The CETA text right now goes far beyond what NAFTA offered in terms of labor mobility, in terms of temporal entry, and in terms of recognition of diplomas and professional certification, that kind of things. It goes further than what the NAFTA agreement includes. It's interesting because Canada, in the negotiation, tried to impose the NAFTA model to the Europeans, but it had to retract a little bit, and it had to accept a different model of negotiation that is much more, I would say, in line with the European practice of labor mobility and professional circulation among the European countries. So yes, it is interesting because if CETA is negotiated, and if there is a EU-US agreement of that sort, okay, it will mean that there will be stronger labor mobility between Canada, US, and the EU than there is between Mexico and Canada and the US. Okay, this is the kind of disintegration effect that I was mentioning in my talk.
Thanks.
My two observations was I agree, competitive liberalization. We have to think about the fact that if you look at the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia, we're not part of that. So, we really do need to figure out that we are not only in TPP, but we're also outside of other agreements. So if we really do want China, India, and others to come to the table in terms of trade and investment rules, you have to set the agenda. And I think this is why TTIP is so significant, so important in terms of WTO+. My second point would be related to trade and services and labor, and obviously the GATS model, Mode 4. But Europe is still struggling with this as part of service liberalization. We only have about 200,000 people in terms of professional services that actually are truly mobile around Europe. It's technically there on paper, but it's very difficult in practice. So I would say that an occupational licensing is a very big state-level issue in the United States. So it's not that easy. I think you need to think about two issues. One is temporary mobility, and one is the right of establishment. and one goes to, and they have different dynamics, and they attract different kinds of labor. And we are in Europe really moving in this area, which is why I said to you, pay attention to what we're doing in our Single Market Act, because one issue is we look at third country nationals and their mobility rights and their temporary mobility rights, and we now have a blue card process going on. The blue card process, though, is a little disingenuous, and it's probably relevant for NAFTA or North America, because if you do get a blue card and you get the right to work for 4 years within the EU, you can't then take it to all the member states. It's only to reside in the particular member state that you've been given the blue card. The second issue is we are moving in terms of professional cards. And these will be professional mobility cards for the medical sector, very important for engineers and others. And that will give you the rights of professional mobility if you are an EU citizen. So we've got a whole host of very, very new initiatives emerging in this sector in Europe, which I think may be good models, innovation, or good best practices. But do take a look, in terms of the fact that we are moving with recognition of certifications and diplomas. That's not easy. That's really, really not easy. I mean, I hate to use any particular country, but I will, as a really nice, pertinent example. But we only have around 9,000 notaries in France. Now, you think about a notary. I go to my local, store, or I go above my town hall and get a notary. We only have about 9,500, and they've come before the case. You have to buy one with a license, and you have to get approved by the Ministry of Justice, and you have to buy one from somebody who's retiring. It's a very, very closed market, and that's just one example of many in Europe. So, we need to liberalize our professions within Europe as well. So I don't want to sort of, give the impression that Europe is completely fully functioning in this area.
Thanks very much. I think we can take a couple more questions from the audience. We have two right here in the front row. We'll take both of these.
Thank you. Good morning. David Nelson with GE. Thank you all for a very stimulating presentation, very interesting. I'd like to focus in on one point actually that Kenneth made, I think, about one of the objectives of trade negotiations is not just to open foreign markets, but to reduce the cost of supply chains so our own companies are more competitive globally, which is a very important point that's often forgotten, I think. As a global company with global supply chains, including small and medium enterprises all over the world, that's really key for us. It's becoming increasingly complicated, and this kind of gets to that fifth point up there on the screen about integrating, modernizing preferential trade agreements. When our salespeople are bidding on a project someplace, they have to figure out, okay, what are the rules of origin that apply to our product? What are the disciplines that affect? How can we set a price? In order to set the price of an offer, we have to understand this whole supply chain and all the impact across the globe. So, Ambassador Hills, you mentioned the possibility of an eminent persons group reviewing the U.S.-EU negotiations to see how it impacts NAFTA and how that can be integrated and modernized, which I think is a great idea, leaving aside the question of whether Mexico and Canada could actually join the negotiation, that as a second best. And I'm wondering how realistic is that to happen, and could it be expanded to look more broadly than just TTIP, but look at the question of U.S. trade agreements, especially the ones that include numerous countries, and see if there's a way to harmonize, standardize, and simplify the disciplines, the rules of origin. Certainly accumulation of rules of origin is key in there, but also to simply make it easier for companies, and we can do it, we're a big company, but for the small companies, for everybody else to understand the rules and apply them more effectively and harmonized way. Thank you.
Thanks.
Very briefly, Robert Schroeder with International Investor. I just want to pick up on a quick comment that Ambassador Hills made about it's a process of educating the American public or leaders. I do think a lot of business people are well aware of these issues, but what they see is a lack of differentiation. And my question goes to the heart of that. They see repeatedly that trade agreements have been made and not always with the same results. We, for example, are very much in favor of trade with our Latin American neighbors. We think the beneficial effects for the U.S. economy are vivid and apparent. Same, we believe, holds true with Europeans, who we believe, by and large, would trade fairly with us. But we don't see that always and everywhere. And what I think there's a bit of a disappointment on the part of American business people that there's been a lack of differentiation when it comes to who's trading fairly with us, where the deficit's the worst. Maybe we should reward those who seem to trade fairly with us and not always be seeking further agreements with those who don't trade fairly.
Thank you. I just got carried away and just realized we're almost out of time here, but we've been having such a good discussion. So we'll just go down the line one last time and just ask you to please keep your comments brief this time so we can respect people's time.
Well, to respond to David's very good point, I think that the high-level eminent persons group that I recommended has been used. It's a device that has been used in other circumstances, for example, with APEC. Not always successful, but useful. But it's a fallback position. I think the business community has to stand up and really persuade that this is a direction you want to go. And, you know, we were sitting on the sidelines of trade for 3 years of this administration, and now we're playing catch up, and we're almost choking over the festival of goods before us. But if we don't deal with these issues, we are going to fall behind. And there has been mention of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, where China is doing an agreement, and we're doing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where China's not a part. It'd be really quite unique that we come through these two agreements without the two largest economies being governed by the rules. And though there will be, but this is competitive liberalization. It was actually our starting, the TPP, that got the RCEP going. And when we saw RCEP moving forward, it gave us some energy to move forward on TTIP. So I do think competitive liberalization and business support could come out with a very good outcome. As far as not trading with people that are allegedly unfair, and obviously you think that we are perfect, that's what we have dispute settlements about. That's the WTO is the finest international organization that exists on the face of the globe. What other organization has rules that govern 159 governments as diverse as those that are members? And what other organization brings those parties together when there is a dispute? And we have disputes with our best friends, Canada and Mexico. But we go to the WTO. And when we are found to be wrong or they found to be in error, the WTO puts a ceiling on the retaliation. If we didn't have the WTO, we would have the law of the jungle. And there would be no ceiling on the retaliation. The world would be in shambles as it was in the 30s. So we trade with all sorts of people. We should lead by example on the kinds of things that make the trade regime work. And we should absolutely support the organizations that raise the standards. And we could do more. And when we say we, who is we? It's not always the government. It's the business community that benefits so much. So I hope you will.
Very quickly, I just want to touch upon the issue of rules of origin, which is a key element in trade negotiations and that sometimes does not get the respect that it deserves. I think that in order for trade agreements to really operate correctly and to communicate with each other and provide opportunities for businesses, which is in the end what you intend to do with trade agreements, we need to work on the issues of origin accumulation. There's the discussions going on in TPP on different sectors and different aspects of how we're going to make that work and how we can strengthen that. Mexico had, for example, different trade agreements with Central American countries. That is a priority in all of the discussions. And it's a priority for Mexico. And within the NAFTA, we've made many changes on that, as you know, throughout the years, and we have to continue to do so. One of those changes in particular is what was key to bring back television manufacturing into North America when it had left to go to Asia with the new generation TVs. And with the changes that took place in the rules of origin, we were able to bring back the new generation components and the production of televisions in North America. So that's an example of how rules of origin work.
Also on the rule of origin, I think this is, again, this is key, and I think that it has been, and I'm not certain that in the CETA negotiations they have really come around this problem. As I said in my presentation, what is the Canadian content of a car exported from Canada to Europe? There are not many of them. There are 13,000, I think, but still, it's quite impossible to make, a precise value of the Canadian content of a car. In the negotiation with Europe, Canada suggested that there won't, that we don't work with a system of accumulation, and that we use the NAFTA model, which is to certify in a certain way the fact that there is a North American origin. So there would have been a CETA origin in that case, but the Europeans refused this scenario. So we are kept with this problem of accumulation. I think that if there is one issue for which it should be evident that it doesn't make sense to negotiate separately with the European Union, it's the question of rule of origin. But unfortunately, I think that we will have to. But of course, the problem will be left to the exporters, who will have to figure out how to fill the form and certify the content, the Canadian content of a car, if this producer wants to benefit from the new CETA tariff, which would be a non-tariff. So you're perfectly right, and it illustrates the kind of problems. And of course, it also illustrates the fact that this is something that we've been discussing for 20 years. You will remember that when we negotiated NAFTA, there was a committee that was supposed to get us out of the rules of origin and to adopt some kind of an alternative system that would bring us to something like closer than towards a custom union. But this is something that we failed, and the business communities for the past 20 years, both in Canada, in the US, and Mexico, have asked our three governments to get out of this system that is so unfair for business people and producers. But we've not been able to do it. So maybe now the situation that we are facing show us what we should have done for the past 20 years and have failed to do. But you're perfectly right.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, I think that I agree with almost everything that was said earlier. The 2 points I would make is the political time frame we're in. We need to be cognizant of that because the midterm elections are coming up in the United States, but the European Parliament will have a turnover, so we have a window of opportunity. The second comment from a business perspective is when we do the free trade agreements, there is, if we really want mutual recognition to work and really want to make ease of business capacity, we make reference to international standards, and are our domestic regulations equivalent to international standards? And we took a look at the Korea EU one. 74 of the EU standards met international requirements. One had to be amended to be brought in line with international standards, but then it pushed Korea. We found 50 of theirs were equivalent to international standards, but they now have to amend 29 of theirs domestically. When you do that, that's the work that has to be done. You can negotiate the deal, but it's the implementation afterwards that takes time. So you're not going to perceive and get the benefits until that's implemented. And that does take time after the fact. Supplemental deals, amendments, and so forth, and domestic rule change. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Just want to once again thank all the programs that came together here at the Wilson Center to make this possible. The Canada Institute, David Biet, Duncan Wood, obviously, and us, the Mexico Institute, also Kent Hughes, and the Program on America and the Global Economy, Christian Osterman and the Global Europe program. Thanks also, special thanks to Michael Geary, who's here in the front row, who's a fellow with us at the Wilson Center from Europe and has helped us all understand TTIP and what's happening here better. And thanks to all this other staff who helped make this possible. One more time, can we thank our panelists?
Very interesting. I know nothing.
Great job. Thank you so much.
This is fun.